Hi, and welcome to week 11 of EDC 420. This week, we transition from our focus on second language acquisition theories and practices to thinking about assessment, and specifically how we are assessing multilingual learners in the classroom and how we think about designing language proficiency assessments. This topic may be one that you have a lot of familiarity with, especially if you work in schools. I imagine many of you, if you are studying to become an educator as a pre-service teacher, have already encountered some learning in your other coursework around assessment. So we'll be building upon some of those understandings you bring, while also hopefully giving you some new lenses and tools for analysis as you think about what makes for an effective and authentic assessment for multilingual students or for language learners. To begin, I introduce our final major assignment of the course, which is the standardized assessment critique paper. This paper isn't due until the end of the course, but I want you to have this paper on your mind as you're engaging with the content this week, so you can start to think about some of the tools for analysis you might be using and which assessment you might choose to focus on as you think about different standardized language assessments. So you'll begin by watching an overview video where I walk you through the assignment and the rubric. And from there, we dive into this week's content. We start with a wonderful overview chapter from Dr. Wayne Wright, in which he provides a nice introduction into some of the key concepts that you'll be using and you'll be thinking through as you start to analyze language assessments. Some of those include reliability, validity, and bias. And he also teases out the difference between criterion referenced tests versus norm referenced tests, and formative versus summative assessment. So for that book, for that chapter, I begin with a lecture video where I give you kind of an overview of or a deeper dive into some of those concepts. And then he, like I said, has a really nice introduction into what a lot of these key ideas related to assessing multilingual learners are that you'll need to know for this portion of the course. We then move into a second chapter, this one by Herrera and colleagues that looks at assessment accommodations for teachers who work with linguistically diverse students. So you'll see some repeated concepts that you learn about from the Wright chapter, and also some additional examples of more authentic assessments like portfolio and performance-based assessments that'll help you think about alternative ways to assess multilingual learners and to assess all of your students that might give you more insight into what students know and can do. And then I follow that up with a brief lecture video where I give you some more examples of what these authentic assessments can look like. Building upon that understanding, we then move into thinking about what would it mean to not just have authentic assessments, but to have deliberately multilingual assessments, or what some have called a heteroglossic approach to assessment. This builds upon some of the learning we've done so far in this course around translanguaging, as it really pushes us to think about, how can we make our assessment practices less monolingual, and how can we decenter English so that we can have a more holistic understanding of what our students know and can do. And so we'll launch that section with a brief lecture video, and then you'll be reading a chapter from Margot Gottlieb's book on assessment, where she provides a framework for how we might assess multilingual learners in a way that embraces translanguaging. I also love how Dr. Gottlieb breaks apart assessment into three different frames, three different lenses. So she talks about assessment as learning, which is kind of students' own self-awareness of their learning, like self-assessment. Assessment for learning, which is kind of the formative process that informs teacher understanding of how your students are making progress towards the different objectives. And assessment of learning, which is more of a summative process, right? Thinking about what students have learned at the end of a lesson or unit, and also could be like a high-stakes assessment or a unit test. I think those different lenses help broaden the way we sometimes think about assessment and really center the importance of students kind of having their own touch point on their learning, of teachers having constant formative touch points of student learning, and then gathering that summative data at the end of a unit or a lesson. And to make that a bit more concrete, or to make the multilingual approach a bit more concrete, there's a video you'll be watching of a teacher taking a translanguaging approach to assessment. So to give you some examples of what this actually looks like in a middle school classroom in this case. So that will be the bulk of our different engaging with assessments. But then we close by looking at language assessments specifically. And because you're going to be doing this for your final paper, I encourage you to spend some time not only watching the lecture video and the video about the WIDA access test that I provide, but also reviewing some language assessment websites and resources. So you can start to think about which assessment you might want to focus on. Now, in Rhode Island, the WIDA access test is the test that's used in our state as a measure of multilingual learners' English language development. So you may want to explore that one if that's one that you use or may be using. Another test that's used in other states and in some bilingual programs is the Las Links assessment, which can also look at English and Spanish. And if you teach in a world language context, you might be interested in looking at the Apple assessment, which is for world languages. So those are, again, you can choose whichever one is of interest to you. And if there's ones beyond that that you want to explore, that's great as well. But that section of our week this week will give you some insight into what these assessments are, so you can begin to plan how you might approach the analysis of them. And then we close with reflecting and discussing, and our final praxis quiz. For the reflection this week, I want you to choose one discussion question that speaks to you or is interesting to you to respond to. And then I've created an application activity in which you'll be watching a short clip of a student's speaking sample and using a tracking sheet to follow along and thinking about what that sheet affords you as a way to assess and evaluate students speaking. And so that is it for this week. I hope you enjoy our dive into assessment as we transition to the latter part of the course. I look forward to seeing the sense you're making of these different approaches and lenses and terminology in the discussion board. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks.